This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation, with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Writer Life. Today I'm going to look at a subject that I've pondered for a great many years, and I'm going to ask the question, what role does tradition play in life? I think it's a pretty interesting question, even if, it is kind of a strange question to ask, and yet if you do ask, you'll find that everybody has a completely different answer. Now, some will talk of being a traditional male or female. Some will talk rituals, celebrations and events. And a great many will talk of marriage, courtship, relationships, and let's not forget possibly one of the most important topics, traditional families. Now if you pick up a dictionary and open it up and look it up, it will tell you that tradition is the transmission of customs or beliefs from generation to generation, or the fact of being passed on in this way. And it's also seen as a long established custom or belief. If you consider the answers that you get, you'll very soon find out that actually, for most people, it is actually a personal belief, not so much a group belief. It's kind of a personalized way of being and living, and it spans many generations. I know so many people who will say things like, well, my gran always did it this way, or that's how my dad showed me. And to a degree, yes, many of the things people see as traditions were handed down to them by one of the previous two prior generations. Now, the problem with that is they do not always apply to everybody. And in many cases, they are just one person's way of doing things. And they feel that because they do it that way and their family members did it that way, anybody not doing it the same way is somehow odd or wrong. When we encounter people like this, they are usually, there usually are problems, especially if they're strong-willed people. And they never take kindly to others using a more modern way of achieving the same goal. In Esther the Kingdom and the Curio Chronicles, I look at tradition and work it into the plot in a few different ways, and it is usually delivered by the vehicle of somebody changing things and modernizing, which at times is frowned upon. And, I can put my hand up and say, yeah, there are times when I think it's just being done because people feel it should be done that way. There's no real logical reason why such and such a thing should be changed. They just do it. Classic example, Windows 10. When will Microsoft leave it alone? It was great. It worked brilliant. And now it constantly goes wrong. It drives me insane, especially when I'm in the midst of recording a podcast. In Esther the Kingdom, when Robbie's two children, Iona and Halbert, are born, Robbie takes great pride in holding his children up in front of the sacred oak and calling to the green world and his Lord by asking them to accept his children as a part of them. Now, this is something his father did with him and his grandfather did before that, and it is a custom that has been done all down his line. So really, without understanding why, Robbie feels this very strong need to ensure this important ritual is continued, and he stands with his friends and family to perform this sacred act before witnesses. Now, it's not just a sacred tradition in his family. It has actually been part of the ritual of the Earth Faith for a very long time. Now, it is true. It happened for many generations, and that is seen actually in the Countess of Darkness. After a ritual that is performed in honour of Morgana, the following day, because she has little understanding what has happened to her, she talks to the maid, Goethe, who explains that her father stood in the circle and held her up for all to see and named her his child with great pride shortly after she was born. Now, when you consider that the time elapsed between the Countess of Darkness and heirs to the kingdom is about, approximately 1,000 years, it's evident that for the people this is something that should be observed and kept as an important part of their life. It is learned by each new generation by seeing and hearing about it from the generations prior, and so it has become an ingrained part of life. Now, I'm pretty sure, if we all sit and think for long enough, most people could think of one thing that fits their life, as they too believe that this is one tradition that no matter what, it should be upheld. In the Curio Chronicles, Marjorie uses traditional values in order to dictate every aspect of village life and also its inhabitants' behaviour, so much so that she rules with an ironclad grip on the whole of the village. Birch simply asks, is this tradition, or is this Marjorie's interpretation of tradition as a means of control? Now, it is true that Birch does kind of have a habit of smashing up the ideals of the past in her quest to modernise. But she does ask the question after hearing Chloe, who makes an approach to Abby and apologises in Abigail's Summer, where she actually states, "Look, Abby, I don't want us to be enemies. To tell you the truth, the other night I was jealous. I did not have the sort of courage that you have. God, I would love to have hair like yours, and I want you to know I actually really admire you for it. Look at me. I have the right top, the right skirt, and the right shoes, so as not to offend the old ones. I have a wardrobe at home full of great clothes, but I cannot wear them here. I have to sneak into Oxendale on my night off to wear them." The tradition of Wootton is such that even the young who've always traditionally dressed more modern are not allowed to under the rules of Marjorie's grip. They're not even allowed to deviate from what is deemed the proper way for young ladies to be presented. So, one has to ask, is it tradition, or just enforced dogmatic belief that even controls the personal decisions of all of the villagers? Tradition, to a degree, is a central aspect of both Kingdom and the Curios. For all parties, it has become a core aspect of life. In Kingdom, it is literally a ritual part of their lives, which in this case is the Earth Faith, or a pagan belief. For the Curios, it's very, very different, because to a degree, it is here we see a really big culture clash. The Curios, with their modern thinking and approach to life, which does follow, the traditional patterns of teenage rebellion, go against Marjorie's straight-laced idea of what was once traditional conservative England. So, it's clear in Wootton that, two-tone dyed hair is seen as untraditional. The fact that in every other city and town across England it's normalised outside of Wootton, it makes no difference at all to Marjorie. It is her idea and belief system that rules the day. And as a result, Abby suffers shame and victimisation at the hands of those who are aligned to Marjorie. So, you've got to ask the question, who is right here? I suppose it depends really on which way you look at it, but, from where I'm sat, the biggest problem with tradition is, I feel, that it all depends on who you actually ask. And that is something that I've played around with a lot, especially in the Curio Chronicles, where two cultures collide, precisely because all parties are actually conforming to their traditional cultural roles. As I was able to highlight this superbly, when reality really does hit Birch right in the face, as they walk away from the annual summer meeting, and Birch encounters what are Wootton Dursley's drinking laws. Edwina looked at Birch. "You do know the Hunters closes its bar at 10 on Fridays, don't you? It's why all of us go to Oxendale. Birch stopped dead in her tracks and looked at her watch. Then Debs and me. You cannot be freaking serious. It's 9:45. What kind of dark age shit is that? Debs shrugged. That's what it's like here, Birch. The parish council has a long arm. They get to make the rules, and to avoid disorder, the bar closes early Friday, Saturday and Sunday. I nodded at her. Debs was right. I mean, Hattie was known for trying to change that rule. But the sad truth was, the parish had a 14th century law that let them overrule certain aspects of life, and Marjorie had ensured that no one would ever be drunk on the streets of the village after 10. Birch looked at me in shock, and I shrugged at her. Now do you understand everything I told you at uni? This is the village of the damned, and she has all the powers. Now do you understand why I did not want to come home? She was visibly shaken. Why do you think all the young here move away, Birch, or go to Oxendale for nights out? It's wrong, and I'm pretty sure it's illegal. I shook my head. No, Birch, it's all sewn up in legal red tape. Trust me, Hattie's tried several times to undo it. We do not live by the same rules you have at home in Upper Mill. It is clear that what is seen as the traditional role for conservative women is strictly enforced in Wootton with an almost, dictatorial enforcement. Marjorie will not allow a woman to be seen drunk in public on the streets of Wootton, because her traditions tell her no self-respecting woman would ever do that. I mean, if you think about it, Hattie drinks, but she's never drunk on the streets. Even she conforms to a degree. I think there's kind of an important message to be gained here. When you give a traditionalist power, they rule with a fake morality based on belief that only works for some. I see this every day in real life. None more so than, let's be honest, look at our own parliament in Great Britain. It's an institution that is based on one of probably the oldest traditions in the world. And yet, under the guise of that tradition, they make decisions that have absolutely nothing to do with the wishes of the people. Just like Marjorie. Once they get their seats, all promises go out of the window as they work to the benefit of all of their cronies, and not to the benefit of the common man or woman, whose votes actually was what put them in their seats in the first place. Looking at the world today, it appears to me that, much like Wood and Dursley, it really does not matter what party you represent. The behaviour appears to be pretty much the same, act for self-interest, and in a sense, that is yet another tradition that is actually worldwide. It was always my intent to hold a mirror up to society and highlight the hypocrisy when writing the Curio Chronicles. And I'll not deny, there are many layers of it. I was unsure if many of the readers would pick up on it. And to be honest, I simply hope some of my usual readers, with the understanding of, some of the ways in which I work and process things out, they would pick up on it and maybe look deeper than most other readers. Some traditions are important and they're worth keeping. I mean, personally, I feel respect, integrity and compassion are very long-standing traditions of the human race. Yet it does feel like in the last decade they've been somewhat eroded away. I've always felt that there is a need for some form of modernisation. And yet, as a great believer of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I've seen a trend of late that is, modernisation for modernisation's sake. And it's most certainly not traditional. I'm reminded of a young phone sales assistant who very sadly encountered me a few years ago looking for a new phone. And I feel I did somewhat try his patience, to the point of giving him almost a breakdown. when he showed me an all singing and all dancing brand new smartphone. Now, in truth, I just needed a new phone, so if it rang, I could talk to people. And yeah, at times I can be that kind of single-minded. He held it with absolute adoration as he explained it was a phone, a camera, an MP3 player. It had a video recorder as well as a digital calendar and a notebook PC. And it all fitted neatly and beautifully into the palm of my hand. I was impressed, I cannot deny. But I simply did not need it, as I tend to like things simple and easy to work. A tradition, maybe, that comes from my own upbringing. I explained that I had a very high quality digital camera at home. I had a PC desktop computer and a laptop, and I hated the sound quality of MP3s, as it was very, very crude compared to my preferred choice of CDs and vinyl records. I had no real use for a calendar, and I was actually a writer, so I used the word processor with a very clicky keyboard on a large screen, as it made writing so much easier for me. So I told him, save it for someone who's impressed. Just sell me a basic phone. Okay, so I was born in an older generation, long before the internet and modern tech. And so I suppose my lack of enthusiasm was pretty much based in the sense that this was simply yet another bloody gadget I didn't understand, and I had to spend days figuring it out, getting frustrated, and losing my temper. And honestly, I couldn't be bothered. I was on the road a lot, so I just needed a phone, which was how my customers talked to me at the time. His response was one of shock and revulsion. He got very upset. His lip even trembled. Poor lad. He had no idea how to deal with someone like me. And he ended up getting his manager to serve me, which, I was fine with. And I chose a very basic, non-smart phone. And I was happy with it. I do get it. There was a culture clash. The young have embraced technologies in ways an old Luddite like me possibly never will. Our value system clashed. He could not understand how I could live without one, and yet I was living proof that his new traditional way of communication was surplus to requirement. Although I will happily admit now, I now own an all singing, all dancing smartphone care of my wife. So given time, and some space, I did actually learn to fit in better and embrace a more modernistic tradition. You see, the point is, I was being traditional in my belief that all new technology was not really required to achieve my aim, i.e., it was taught to my customers. Or was the young assistant being traditional by trying to convince me to modernise and enhance my life? In a way, thinking back now, I feel both of us were possibly both right. You see, this is the point of writing. I love nothing better than pulling things apart and having a really good look at them, and then I put them all back together again in a way that makes the reader think. Now, I'm not going to deny, it's that part of putting stories together that I really, really love. And in a strange sort of sense, I hope that it makes people who read what I write think a little deeper about the lives that they're actually living. Now, at this point, I have to say, one tradition that comes up often always gets me in trouble, and religion is a subject I love to dip into occasionally. And when it comes to tradition, let's be honest, how could I leave it out? After all, we live in a modern world built on democracy, of which, in the West particularly, Christian belief is seen as the cornerstone of civilization. I'm just going to add here that looking at social media and the many wars that are currently going on this planet at the moment, and especially looking at modern politics, I gotta say, I'm not that convinced that we're all that civilized as a race. But, for argument's sake, let's look at it. Now, to be quite honest, there's a lot of really good messages within Christian belief that I actually think are really good examples for people to consider as part of their life. Now, as to whether or not I'm convinced that Christianity is the traditional value system of the British Isles, I cannot deny. Looking at the many cultures that now happily live here, I have got my doubts. In Esther the Kingdom, Book 4, Runestone visits Bishop John Stevens, where she points out that what the monks of his religion under Brother Argos are doing to her cousin Sapphire is wrong. It's barbaric and it's outdated. It is to a degree a tradition that was very much in vogue a short space of time in the 1600s. But in today's world, the act of pronouncing people as a witch is long since discredited, and yet Argus revived it to cater to his need. Runestone beautifully highlights this and explains that, to John Stevens, that actually his traditional beliefs and hers have a great deal in common, because his faith of Christianity is actually set to a pagan calendar, as the early Christians had similar events in a way of trying to win over the pagan people to their cause. Now, in the Countess of Darkness, Morgana sees Arthur's conversion to Christianity as a betrayal of his people, and she fights against him to protect what she sees as the tradition of the true people of Britain. Now, in a sense, at that time, she is actually right. Growing up, she had seen and learned how the Romans came to the land as pagans at first, which did actually help them assimilate into society. Over time, as Rome adopted Christianity, they began to change, and then they began to attack and slaughter the Druids, which at that time, they were the pagan leaders of the spirituality of all the pagan people. Now, it makes complete sense to me that Morgana, having witnessed that or learned about that, when she saw Arthur do the same thing, she would have expected him to treat her people better, because they had actually helped him in his early days establish himself as the king. So she sees his conversion as the ultimate betrayal and doing the same as the Romans did to the early pagans of Britain. From Morgana's perspective, the traditional customs of her people were more important than Arthur's crown, because in her mind, their traditional beliefs were the core of her people and her own identity. And if we just look back to the past of modern Britain, we can see it. Before the Romans arrived, Celtic belief ruled most of the UK, right the way across France into Germany, even as far as actually the borders of Italy. Celtic belief was actually the true heritage of the people of the British Isles. Now, that is kind of the very point of Esther the Kingdom and the Curios, because it's less about the tradition and it's more about the identity of the person. Marjorie's belief goes to the heart of who she is. Just like with Morgana, the beliefs of her people were her own identity. For Marjorie, it is the heart of who she is. Without her belief, she's nothing. And in a way, the same applies to the Curios, just as it does Morgana and Robbie. I've come to see some tradition in the same light as a sort of a dogmatic belief. I feel they are at heart our own identity, and so therefore they are vastly important aspects of who we are as people. Now, our national identity, for example, is a different thing. It really is an important part of who we are. And maybe that does have something to do with the fact that Britain has been invaded for thousands of years. And so we've always been forced to accept new ideas and new cultures against our will. So we just naturally rally around the cause of unity, which, if you look at Great Britain today and you see how multicultural and diverse it's become, again, you look at the Chinese people who are living in Great Britain, you look at the West Indians who are living in Great Britain, the Polish who are living in Great Britain, they've all kind of come together. And, when there's a big event, They all celebrate together for the sake of the nation. I actually think it's one of the greatest strengths of the British people that we've been able to welcome other creeds and cultures in, and also to a degree work in their traditional values. I mean, when you think about it, curry is now the traditional dish of Great Britain. It's an Indian dish. I suppose if you live in Lancashire or Yorkshire, it's probably pie and chips. But for the rest of the country, curry is literally the most consumed meal. We have this wonderful way of embracing other people's identities and traditions into our culture. And I think, as I said, I think it's one of the greatest strengths of who we are today as a British people. Some traditions I do feel are important. I love the pageantry of the large royal ceremonial occasions, because they date back to pre-medieval times. And I do feel that, I know the young disagree with me, but I actually do feel that they are a very important part of how the British see their history. The young have always been rebellious and been far more open to new things than, say, the older generations, who have always kind of looked on with some form of disapproval. My own youth was very much the same. I can smile now as I remember some of the very strict and stern people of my own past who viewed some of my dress code and behaviour as utterly disgraceful. In my writing, I try not to take sides and show all of the attitudes of every character and then let the readers decide. In the Curio Chronicles, admittedly, it's Abigail's story, written from her point of view. But again, I try to hold back and allow her to learn and understand why things are the way they are, which, to a degree, she does as her understanding starts to grow. In a sense, she understands Marjorie perfectly. But when in Curious Summer, the new vicar Gail arrives in the village, it's actually Birch who voices it best when she states, "If you want a white flag between us," and Marjorie, "Well, I'm sorry, Gail, that's not going to happen. I can work things out with most people, but having to live with what she has done, there's no way back for me. I've accepted her position, and I know it will never ever change. The two of us will never really have peace." Now, it's clear that Birch fully understands Marjorie, and also how their belief will never align. Marjorie is stuck in the past of her cultural dogma, and Birch has embraced a wholly different set of beliefs. I mean, she's right to a degree. Peace will only be made if one side concedes to the other. And with two strong characters such as Birch and Marjorie, I think it's pretty clear that's never going to happen, as both of them are firmly rooted in their belief that they are actually right. Both of them have established traditions that are suited to the life that they want to live. And while both of them understand each other, neither will ever deviate. I think this idea that everyone has to uphold tradition is actually what is dividing this modern world we all live in. I've seen that, in people who read the curios, as they cannot look past certain elements of the story, which are based in modern culture. And it really does highlight their generational divides, because they only focus on their own belief system, which is based in their generation. Few have the will to step across the divide and try to understand what is a modern, evolving world. They'd much rather retreat into their trenches of yesteryear, which is, I get it, it's their comfort zone. There are very few that do try hard to understand, and I do find that actually at times quite comforting, because it creates dialogue between generations, and I feel that's always a huge positive, as both parties then benefit from their discussions and they learn more about each other, and they do achieve compromise. I feel that through my time as a writer, I've expanded my mind far more than maybe I probably would have done living as a non-writer's life. I have learned through writing to see and try to understand why people believe what they do, most of which was taught them at an early age. The value system of morality has changed. I mean, it's changed so much in my life, as I've seen people younger than me adopt completely different values to mine. They do at times challenge me. I mean, I see it in my own children and some of their friends, and a great deal of this has played a role in the sorts of stories that I try to write. Robbie in Heirs to the Kingdom is a much more modernising figure than, say, his father was. And, as he takes over the running of everything, he does make changes, such as how the Fellowship of the Bowmen operates and, some of the routines within the village. And the ideals, it does challenge the ideals of the people of the village, and it's not always received with great enthusiasm, especially from the likes of people like Agatha Patterdale. And the same goes really for the Curios, as they challenge all of the ideals of the people of Wootton. And I do feel these days it's a very, very important part of life, and the young should actually challenge the older generations, which actually is a tradition that goes back to the start of the human race. The young always rise to challenge and confront the old. Now, the crazy thing about all this is that if you really actually stop and take a moment and really think about it, none of this actually matters. Because the older generations will fade and the young will age. And, their opinions will change with age. And only the traditions of the past that are seen as beneficial will survive. As Abby really does understand at the end of Curio's summer. And she verbalizes it in her thoughts as she walks home. I took a long deep breath and took in the night's air and looked around the village I'd known for all of my life, and nothing looked any different. The fact was, the loss of Madge from the council meant nothing, and that was the saddest thing of all, because at the end of the day, it was one of the things all of us shared in common. All of us loved and wanted to protect the village. I'd never wanted to ruin it, neither had Debs. Her shop was modern, and it was greatly improved, and yet outside it looked as traditional as ever. Even the practice blended in. The Curios wanted to live in peace and be a part of this place. Why had no one ever understood that? I had dyed my hair, and it started a 5-year war. And if it came to an end, I would not complain. But even that would have no bearing on village life. I think I was really starting to understand Birch. She knew. She was always aware that we come and we go as we age. And the village would remain as it has for the last 200 years. It would always have a well-maintained green, always be a place of great beauty, and always attract tourists. It really did not matter who was on the parish council at all. I think it is such an important moment in not just Abby's life, but also that of the readers, because it's at this point, Abby is actually far more correct than most will at first see. The people change, but most things tend to stay the same, and life moves on, and tradition moves with it. Old ones will fade, and new ones will be created, just like that of the witch finders of the 1600s, who are no longer seen as moral. As I come towards the end of this podcast, I think to end, I will add these last few things. But this particular piece is from the very last book of the Curios series. And, Abigail lifts a hand to Marjorie, and she smiles and she says, "Some traditions are worth keeping." Okay, it's a spoiler, but it's not one that will give anything away. But it makes my point nicely. Cultural traditions are vastly important to the individuals within a society, and they need to be understood. The traditions of each generation do to a certain degree come from dogma, and the world is changing, and it cannot be stopped. And I feel at this point, I'll give the very last word to Celia, a favourite character of mine, to be honest, from Abigail's Summer. Marjorie had seen Bev. She had been watching her from her favourite window seat. Good God, what on earth is that? She pointed out of the window with a look of horror glued to her face. Lillian bent down to peer through the curtains. I believe she's a lesbian. She arrived last night at the Hunters. Apparently she's part of Dr. Dixon's security detail. That's what Amy Bosworth told me. The girl certainly looks capable with all those tattoos and muscles. I think she has a rough charm, don't you? Marjorie stared at her in shock. Have you lost your mind? Look at her! In what way or form is that even remotely female? She looks like a painted primate. Celia leaned in for a look. Times are changing, Marjorie. It's like the Cultural Revolution all over again. At some point we'll have no choice but to accept that things are not as they were. Today's all about technology, LGBT, and our innermost thoughts. You can be anything you want to be with these days, and the young have really embraced it. I think I envy them. They have freedoms we'd never been given. Marjorie stared at both of them looking out of the window. Well, it won't bloody happen on my watch. Celia turned and looked at her. We have to embrace change, Madge. If we want this village to last, if we stay the same, it will die. She stood up. This is fiddlesticks. I'll never accept the likes of that walking around this village. It's bad enough that whore brought that other one here with her. We do not need the likes of that poverty-stricken Manchester trash here. I will never allow it. Not ever. It sort of makes the point, doesn't it? Change happens, no matter what you believe in your head. It's a force no one can stop, not even tradition. If you've listened this far and come all the way through the podcast with me, I thank you very, very, very much. If you do like the kind of stuff that I'm putting out, the kind of content I'm putting together based around being a writer and my life and the stories that I create, please give the video a like. And if you've not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. And then that way I can kind of grow the numbers and get more and more people tuning in and listening to the stuff I'm putting together. I'm working on a lot of things at the moment. I'm trying to get the Coffee and Conversation section rolling. That's took a lot more work than expected, and I'm not technically trained, so I'm getting there very slowly. I'm learning a lot of new things, so my modernist traditional friends would be very, very happy to know that. I shall be back next week with something else, and I will hopefully create something that will make you think. And if you think, maybe you'll want to write, and if you don't want to write, then maybe you just want to pick up a book and read. And let's be honest, there is nothing better to pass the summer than just sitting back and reading a really good book. So until next week, I bid thee good day, and I will see you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Writer Life podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, or there are areas of Robin's stories you would like him to discuss, please add your thoughts and questions in the comments, and we will include them in a future episode. You can follow Robin on all his social media links, which you will find listed below, and please, like and subscribe to this channel, so you get the latest notifications when he posts. All Robin's books are available in digital and print formats to purchase or download through all online book sales sites.